thank you a lot, the chair and the organizers, for such an interesting conference and an opportunity. Thanks a lot. Good morning, everybody. So, as the title is Dialogue and Counseling, so it is basically the word dialogue is used in a particular sense, actually, the way David Bohm uses it, actually. So the whole presentation, I won't call it a paper as such. It's mainly only a kind of a presentation or a talk, not a full-fledged paper or anything. So it is mainly based on David Bohm's account of dialogue, his book on dialogue, and how it can be used, how it can be one method, obviously not the sole method, for philosophical counseling. Also, having listened to some talks in the conference, I would rather go for the term philosophical practice than counseling, because counseling implies a counselor and a counselee, whereas practice can be more than that. Actually, it can include the distinction, but it can be more than that. Moreover, counseling often suggests some kind of therapeutic aims or therapeutic dimension is there, or that implication is there, whereas practice can be more than therapeutic, or it need not be therapeutic also. It can be just preventive, or making us more and more philosophically healthy, to borrow another term that I got from the conference. So that can also be the purpose of dialogue or philosophical practice. So how dialogue in the Bohmian sense can be used for that. That is what the presentation is all about. So in the way David Bohm envisages or proposes it, and he practiced it also, at least in certain circles. So I will give an overview of that in the beginning. So etymologically, dialogue means through the meaning of the word, dia and logos. So going through the meaning of the word, that is a etymological meaning of it. So what happens is basically the meaning flows. So what happens in a typical setup of dialogue? Of course, the dialogue that he proposed was in a group of around 20 to 30 people. But at the same time, he also said that you can have it in a small group also of 2 people, 3 people, or even individually also. It is possible. At least in principle, it is possible. But it may be easier in a big group, given its overall aims that will become clear. So the meaning has to flow, and nobody tries to win or dominate. So basically, the spirit of common participation. So how to have that common participation? So there are some guidelines for that. There are only guidelines, and there can be at most a facilitator. Nothing more than that. There is nobody who leads it. So there is no counselor and counselee. Everybody is on equal platform, but somebody may be in a better position to point out that the group is going in a correct direction. So he may be called a facilitator. He or she may be called a facilitator. So in the dialogue group, everybody is open to question fundamental assumptions regarding all that is there. So there is no common agenda, there is no common topic or anything, but everybody is free to speak. At the same time, they are expected to question their assumptions, actually, any kind of assumption, whether it is about the purpose of life or even the question, who am I? So who am I is also normally understood through some assumption, actually, isn't it? If we believe that it is the mental self that exists, that itself is some kind of an assumption. Normally, most of us don't read it as an assumption, but we act on that assumption, and it remains implicit. But we may have to go to even that level to question that also. So our role as individuals, all these things can be questioned. And the point is that we should not act on that assumption, or we should not react based on that assumption. So we should be able to see the assumptions as they are, as and when they crop up during the dialogue. So basic idea is that it goes into the whole thought process. So the basic target or the basic aim that can be achieved through the process of dialogue is to realize that it is basically the similar thought process that operates in oneself as well as in others. That is why the group becomes important. And the bigger the group, the better. Of course, bigger doesn't mean hundreds or something, but 20 to 30 group, because as Bohm himself says, 20 to 30 means you can have a microcosm of the society. You can get people from different cultures, different attitudes. So it is easy, it becomes easier for us to realize that fundamentally similar or even the same thought process operate across individuals. So the whole idea or the basic point is that whatever dysfunction that we think that we think it is there. As far as human thinking is concerned, it's not something that is specific to an individual, but something it seems to be shared across humanity. So that realization can be, we may be able to have that realization in a group setting when we see that similar thought process operate in all of us actually. So normally what happens is that while engaging in thought, we may not pay attention to how the process of thought operates actually. Normally we act on it, isn't it? We become, what is it? We act on the basis of our thought. We take it as reality. We will come to some of these points actually. So it is basically making us able, that in a group setting, it may be easier in a group setting, able to realize that, or to able to pay attention to how thought operates actually. So fragmentation itself is a matter of thought actually, because thought is basically abstract. Thought is abstract, and it is something that abstracts from the reality, the whole, and it is always focused or narrow. It cannot encompass the whole actually. So though the world is shades merging into one, overall the whole world is like that. There is an integration to it, the cosmic whole that is there. But thought always abstract and it focuses on certain things. So it's a matter of attention. We will come to that when we compare this view, or when we try to expand these views based on some other recent developments in study of our psychology of attention or neuroscience of attention. We'll come to that. That's the second part of the paper. So this selection, this focus, narrowed focus, make us feel separate also from others actually. So thought is normally very active. By default, it is active, and it tells us that makes us believe that it tells the way things are. That is the way things are. So this is a common point that we can see in mindfulness literature and all these things. Not to consider thought as a reality, but to suspend it, to look at it without being judgmental, or phenomenologies, bracketing of assumptions. They're all related. There's no doubt in that. So as we have just said, in a typical setup, it can be 20 to 40 people, but as we have said, it can be 2 people or even single individual also, it may be possible. So ideally, the whole idea is that the tacit knowledge from which we have to act, or from which we think we act, that has to be made coherent. But right now, it is not that coherent. That is the main point that Bohm makes actually. So how to make that tacit knowledge coherent? So this kind of group settings which facilitate or which enable us to realize the commonality of thinking process, that in turn can lead to make the tacit knowledge coherent. So just like laser is a matter of coherence actually, isn't it? So it becomes so powerful. Similarly, if our tacit knowledge is coherent, that can become much more powerful, much more harmonious compared to the current tendency towards incoherent, fragmented, and conflict-ridden way of mutual engagement or interaction. So Bohm would say, not just Bohm, many others say that human beings were not always like that. It may be just in the last 5,000 years of civilization that we became, or we started giving so much of importance to thought, so much of importance to abstraction. All these things have happened in the recent past. Recent means it can be 3,000, 4,000 years. Somebody like Julian Jaynes would say there was human beings used to have something called bicameral mind before 4,000 years, and that bicameral mind had a breakdown, and we became this kind of beings who believes that there is an inner I who acts on this, who moves like this, who wants so many things from the world. So that is from that perspective, it is a recent, what is called recent development, dominated by the self, or living as if I were that self. That appears to be a recent development actually. So human right before that, it is presumably, of course, we cannot be 100% sure what was the human mind 5,000 years back, but presumably they were in a much better position as far as the dominance of thinking or harmony is concerned. So the whole purpose of dialogue, as we have said, there is no aim as such, there is no topic as such, there is no aim as such, but the whole purpose is to communicate coherently in truth. That is the purpose actually. So once we are able to see the assumptions and suspend the reaction, now it is important to know that as far as hunter-gatherer life is concerned, it is important. This fast, what we call the fight or flight reaction, fight, flight, or freeze. These are the 3 modes that are open to us. It was important as far as hunter-gatherer life is concerned. Whenever we encounter, it was more likely to encounter threats, direct threats to our biological survival actually. So it's important. At the same time, in our environments, we continue to act on those impulses, presumably because or primarily because we are under the impression that it is a self that exists, not the body, isn't it? Or self is something that is more than the body. So as long as we act on the basis of that assumption that there is a mental self that needs to be protected or to be expanded from the world, we may continue to have that fight or flight mechanism operate. But as such, it is not required, it may not be required. That is an assumption. So dialogue may help us even to see that assumption. That is the whole point actually. So we may be able to suspend it. So and in a group setting, it may be easier actually. So it is important for us to question even the assumption that thought knows the truth, because thought is only an abstraction. It cannot capture the whole. So that point we will come to when we discuss two kinds of attention. Why is it the case that thought may not be able to capture the whole? Because the whole nature of paying attention when thought is dominant, that is only a narrow mode of attention. So the dialogue process will help us to see what is in others' minds without reaching any conclusion. That is also important actually. So thoughts of necessity that also play a bigger role. This is something, for example, necessity with regard to progress or development that plays a big role in our times actually. It is essential that we work towards human progress, human development. So all these thoughts play a bigger role, and it's important that we are able to suspend such thoughts also. Also the connection between thoughts and feeling. This is also something that we often overlook, or we fail to notice that many of the feelings are rather created by our own thought process. We may not be very conscious of thought actually. Much of thought can be unconscious also. It's also important to note that actually what we call thought can encompass all kinds of activity, whether it is unconscious or conscious or a continuity in that. So thought has to be aware of its consequence or the proprioceptive. So proprioception of thought, that means thought is able to realize that it is operating. It's an operation, it's an abstraction, it can be an imagination only, it's not a reflection of what is there. So that proprioception of thought is something that we normally lack actually. Body is proprioceptive, there's no doubt in that, but thought is not normally proprioceptive. So dialogue can help us to make it proprioceptive. So everybody is able to do that in a typical setup of a dialogue. Participatory consciousness can arise. So participatory consciousness, there are two senses. We will come to it here, the partake of and partake in. So partake of is basically a matter of the realization that we are part of the whole. So we are partaking in. We can take something, whatever is there as for our survival, but everybody is part equal whole actually. That is a sense of partaking of. Partaking in is there. We think that we are contributing to the society, we are contributing to the nation, to the group, the institution. That sense is currently it is there, but that is limited. There is another sense of participation, that is a partake of. So only when both senses are given importance, the participatory consciousness can arise. So basically it's a matter of automatically realizing that one is first and foremost a part of the whole, the undivided whole, which can be called the unlimited here, whatever it is unlimited in the sense, it is the whole actually, whose nature we do not even know completely, isn't it? Obviously, we do not know the nature of the whole, but it is important for us to keep in mind as the background. That is the background from which we act, from which we live. That background notion has to be tacitly present whenever we operate. But right now, whenever we are dominated by the thought, which is by its own nature fragmentary, we lose touch with that whole. That is the whole point actually. So dialogue can help us to regain, reconnect with that undivided whole or the unlimited, that possibility. That is the harmony of the individual, the collective and cosmic dimensions of a human being. Collective is already there. We may be a part of a group. It can be a football group. It can be an institute. It can be a nation that is there. And we are able to feel part of it at times at least, but cosmic dimension can be completely missing in that. So it's important for us to harmonize all these different dimensions actually. So literal thought is dominant. Literal thought in the sense where this participatory consciousness is lacking or less. It may not be completely lacking, but it is less. That is dominant for the thousands of years of civilization. And we even have some kind of an idol worship. Someone like Barfield would say that we are like, what we are doing is some kind of idol worship. Whatever is created by thought, we give so much of importance, including technology. We give so much of importance and we are obsessed, fixed on that. That is some kind of an idol worship, actually. So for certain purpose, it's all required. Thought is required. Literal thought is also required. Nobody is questioning its use, but that should not be the central. That should not consume all that is there in the, that is the main point, actually. The core has to be participatory. It is our connection. It is our realization that we are part of the unlimited or the whole. That has to be the fundamental framework or the fulcrum out of which our life revolves. All that other things have their own place, actually. So attention is not inherently, attention is not restricted, but because of the feeling of necessity that we have, but or because of the assumption that we are basically fragmented, separated individuals. Because of that assumption, our attention becomes narrow. So the whole notion of attention, now we will discuss from another vantage point. Actually, recently there was a well-known book written by McGilchrist, whose book, The Master and His Emissary. So what I'm trying to do is that those ideas, the ideas from this book actually, which deals with two kinds of attention and why one attention is dominant, that is consistent with whatever we have told about David Bohm's notion of dialogue, and all of them can together help us in philosophical practice. So there are two types of attention that we talk about: narrow focused and open and diffused. So he calls it left hemispheric and right hemispheric ways of attention. So he would even say that there are two hemispheres, mainly to have two different ways of attending to things, actually. That is the main purpose. Why should we have two hemispheres, actually? Even though both hemispheres are involved in almost all that we do, they do it differently. So if you look at a bird has to narrowly focus on a piece of grain so that it can consume it. And at the same time, it has to pay attention to all that is there around so that it doesn't become a prey. Whenever there is a predator approaches, it should be able to fly. So both types of attention are essential for survival. So there is an evolutionary reason why we have two kinds of attention. And in human being, the narrow one is more verbalized and focused. So it is dominated by language and it is narrow, it is instrumental, it always looks for certain purpose. What will I get? That is a common way of looking at things. And it is focused on the virtual world it creates. Virtual world doesn't mean the cyberspace or anything, but whatever is created by language. It's a matter of imagination or a construction. So it is a focus on that. So whatever is created by oneself doesn't necessarily mean as an individual, but by human beings. So that's why we become so obsessed with technology and all this construction, where whatever is there in the nature becomes secondary, because the narrow focused attention may not be able to pay proper attention to what is there independent of human construction. Whereas the latter, the focused open attention is non-verbal, but it is open and connected. So if you are able to look at a tree without calling it a tree, so when conceptualization is less or nil, then it is a matter of right hemispheric way of looking. So right hemispheric and left hemispheric are not metaphorically used. He says that it is actually the way different hemispheres operate, actually. So he would say that right hemisphere has to be the predominant one, but unfortunately, for thousands of years, left hemisphere is dominant. Presence is primary to representation. So the verbal, the thinking, that is a matter of representation. But before representation, there is presence, there is direct experience. For example, Mark Johnson would say subjects and objects, persons and things are abstraction from the interactive process of our experience of a meaningful self in a world. That is what is primary. Movement is primary. I move, therefore I am. But unfortunately, we end up believing that I think, therefore I am. So the importance given to thinking or tracing our existence to thinking, that is something that restricts us from realizing the whole, because movement is a matter of whole. The moment we realize the movement, then the connection with the rest is there. But when it is abstracted, that connection is lost, actually. So yeah, so right hemispheric way has to be the master, but unfortunately, left hemisphere has become the master. That's what we would say, especially in Western civilization he talks about, but now we can even say that it is global, actually, in a sense. Right, left hemisphere is only supposed to be a what is called a emissary. Just like earlier we talked about literal thought. Literal thought has to be there, it is useful, but it has to be subservient to the participatory consciousness. Similarly here also. So when narrow one is dominant, life becomes eviscerated. Eviscerated in the sense it loses its vitality, the original sense, the meaning that we have by direct connection that is something that is reduced or lost. And once that vitality is lost, we need to fill in everything from various things actually, isn't it? That's why the self ends up looking for happiness from all sources, looking for meaning. So many of the psychological problems that we have can be traced to the feeling of unfulfillment, isn't it? The lack of fulfillment in oneself, always looking for something from everywhere. And obviously, we will not be able to find fulfillment because of the contingency. So many of the psychological problems can be traced to that. There's no doubt in that. So all this can be due to the dominance of the narrow way of looking. So the need for looking and absent body, our often failure to listen to the body, to pay attention to the body, that can also be traced to the narrow verbalized attention. Or even the metaphor of life as a journey. That is the predominant metaphor that we use to understand life actually, because whatever we do, the end result becomes important and we fail to pay proper attention to the present, whatever occurs in the present, because life is understood as a journey. So that can also be understood as a matter of dominance of left hemispheric attention. So the point is that, so if we are able to make use of right hemispheric way of or open diffused attention, if it is given its due, if we are able to do that, that will help us to have a balance between these two ways of attention. So Amishi Jha would say peak mind is one which does not privilege doing over being. So being is primarily a matter of open diffuse attention, where we are able to pay attention without seeking anything. So the instrumentalist way of attention has to become less dominant. It has to be subservient. It has to be there only for a certain purpose. But the overall life can be governed, or life can be what we call carried over by the operation of open diffuse attention, which is the matter of connection. And as you have said, many of the psychological problems that we have can be reduced also, if not eliminated, with the help of that, by balancing of these two modes of attention. And dialogue of David Bohm and all these things basically can help us to have a balance of these two modes of attention, which I believe can be useful for philosophical practice also. Okay, thank you. That's all.